Virtual vice. In a city where virtual fantasies collide with deadly reality, Katie is hired to investigate VR star Vera Lux's murder, unraveling a web of obsession and deceit. The rain poured relentlessly, pooling in the cracked asphalt of the alleyways, reflecting the flickering neon glow of the city's signs. Here, even the rain couldn't wash away the grime. Shadows seemed alive, and secrets festered beneath the surface. Tonight, those secrets belonged to Vera Lux, now dead. I lit a cigarette, watching the smoke curl into the damp night air as Leon's urgent message replayed in my mind. Vera had been killed during one of her virtual performances. Her flawless avatar captivated thousands, while her real body bled out in her apartment, hidden away. The police had already come and gone, leaving behind only yellow tape and unanswered questions. The elevator groaned, carrying me up to Vera's penthouse. It was cold and impersonal, more a stage than a home. In the corner stood her state-of-the-art VR rig, the last vestige of the world Vera had built. In her virtual realm, she was a goddess, selling fantasies to men who believed they mattered. But in death, her fragile reality was exposed. Leon arrived, drenched from the rain, dangerous as ever. His presence dominated the room. "They won't tell me anything," he muttered, his frustration bleeding through. "I need to know what happened to her. She didn't deserve this." I flicked my cigarette into a nearby ashtray and studied him. From what I've heard, she wasn't exactly innocent. His jaw clenched, but his voice stayed calm. She wasn't perfect, but she didn't deserve to be murdered. They were watching her avatar until it just stopped. His voice faltered, a rare glimpse of vulnerability. But Leon always wore masks well. I approached the VR rig, fingers brushing over the controls. Whoever killed her had been precise. "You think one of her clients did this?" Leon moved closer, his breath warm against my neck. "I don't know. That's why I need you. The cops won't tell me anything." His hand grazed my arm, fleeting, almost making me forget why I was there. I turned to face him, tension sparking like static. "Why me, Leon? You could have hired anyone." His smile was slow, deliberate, doing nothing to ease the tension simmering between us. "Because I trust you, and because I know you won't stop until you get the answers, just like old times." Old times. A door I had firmly closed, but Leon always knew how to pry it open again. "I'll take the case," I said, steadying myself. "But don't expect me to play nice. If you're hiding anything, I'll find out." Leon's grin widened, dark and dangerous. "I wouldn't dream of it." As I left Vera's apartment, the rain continued to fall in sheets. I couldn't shake the feeling that this case would be more than just a simple murder investigation. Leon was hiding something. Whether it was about Vera or himself, I couldn't be sure yet. But I was determined to find out. If it meant navigating the shadows of both the virtual and real worlds, so be it. In a city like this, where the line between fantasy and reality blurred, nothing was ever quite as it seemed. The relentless rain outside Vera's apartment soaked me as I crouched beside the VR rig, scanning through the recent logs. Behind me, Leon's presence loomed, his gaze burning into my back as he watched me work. His eyes were always a distraction, a reminder of nights I tried to forget, but never could. "You've always made things look so effortless." Leon's voice slid over me like velvet, smooth and dangerous. I didn't need to turn around to know he was wearing that cocky grin, the one that always weakened my resolve. "Flattery won't make me move faster," I said, focusing on the rig, though my pulse quickened at his words. He stepped closer, his warmth pressing into the space between us. Leon was always dangerous like that. dangerous because I knew I should stay away, but I couldn't. The scent of rain and leather hit me, pulling me back to memories I thought I'd left behind, the kind that made it hard to focus on anything else. "Who says I'm in a hurry?" and he murmured, his breath warm against my skin, sending a shiver down my spine. I stood, feeling the tension grow thicker between us, like a wire pulled taut. "Careful, Leon, you don't want to distract me, not when I'm this close to figuring things out." He stepped closer, his body almost brushing mine, his voice dropping lower. "What if I like distracting you, Katie? You've always been too focused. Maybe that's why you keep circling back to me." His words hung heavy, laced with temptation, and I felt myself being drawn toward him, the magnetic pull I could never seem to resist. My breath hitched. Leon had always been my weakness. He leaned in, his lips dangerously close to my ear, and for a second, I let myself want it. "Vera's rig was tampered with," I said, forcing myself to focus. I turned away from him, pretending not to notice the slight hitch in his breath, the way his eyes darkened just a shade. "It kept running after she was dead. Someone pre-programmed it to keep her virtual self performing, probably long enough to cover up what really happened." Leon moved closer until he was right behind me, his breath warm against the back of my neck. I felt his hand graze my arm, a barely there touch that sent a shiver down my spine, despite my best efforts to stay unaffected. "Are you sure you're not imagining things, Katie?" His voice was a murmur, his lips dangerously close to my ear. "You always did have a wild imagination." I turned to face him, meeting his gaze head on. The air between us crackled with tension, thick and electric. I could feel the pull, the magnetic force that always seemed to drag me back to him, no matter how hard I tried to resist. "I'm not imagining anything," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "Someone wanted her dead, and they wanted it covered up. You wouldn't know anything about that, would you?" His lips curved into a slow, lazy smile, his gaze dropping to my mouth before flicking back up to my eyes. "You really think I'd hurt her? That I'd get rid of her just because she didn't live up to some fantasy?" I held his gaze, refusing to be drawn in by that smooth charm. "You tell me." He stepped closer, his chest nearly brushing mine now, and I could feel the heat radiating off him, the tension between us coiling tighter and tighter. "Vera wasn't just a fantasy," he said softly, his voice low and dangerous. "She was real. Her movements, her personality, all of that was her. The looks, the avatar, that was for the clients. It didn't matter to me. I didn't need that." The way he said it, the way his voice dropped when he spoke, sent a thrill through me that I hated myself for feeling. I knew better, but Leon always had a way of making me forget what was smart, what was safe. He always had a way of making me feel like I was standing on the edge of a cliff, teetering dangerously close to falling. "So you didn't need the fantasy?" I asked, stepping closer, my own voice dropping as the heat between us thickened. "But you didn't mind letting her sell it to everyone else?" He raised an eyebrow, a flicker of something dark passing through his eyes. Vera was in control. She knew how to handle herself, and yeah, she had an AI take over for the more intimate parts. She didn't want to deal with it herself, so she programmed the rig to handle those moments, but I didn't think she had been using it for normal performances. "Intimate parts?" I probed, my voice barely above a whisper. I was close enough to feel the heat coming off him now, to see the way his chest rose and fell with each measured breath. "Yeah," he said, his voice rougher now, lower. "Clients paid big money for those moments, high-end VR prostitution, if you want to call it that. But Vera was smart about it, and those clients, They thought they were getting the real deal, but sometimes they weren't. My pulse raced, the implications of what he was saying sinking in. And if one of them found out they were being played, that they were paying for a fake instead of the real thing? Leon's eyes darkened, his gaze locking on mine, and I could feel the heat rolling off him in waves. Then, yeah, they'd be pissed. Some of them might even be pissed enough to kill. The tension between us was thick now, suffocating, and I could feel myself teetering dangerously close to that edge again. But I couldn't let myself fall, not this time, not with Leon, no matter how much I wanted to. I'm going to find out who did this, I said, stepping back, breaking the spell. His lips curved into that slow, infuriating smile. But there was something deeper in his eyes now, something that sent a thrill through me despite myself. I turned and left, my heart pounding in my chest, the heat of his gaze burning into my back the whole way. To understand the tangled web of Vera Lux's life and death, I needed to enter the world she had mastered, the VR universe, where desire reigned and boundaries blurred. I met with performers and clients who had known her, and every conversation revealed another piece of the puzzle. The performers had mixed feelings about Vera. Some respected her, praising her ability to captivate clients and remain at the top of the VR game. Others weren't so kind, claiming she had been losing her edge, doing anything for money. The rumors were that toward the end, Vera had started accepting requests that would have once been off limits. But not everyone believed the gossip. Some said that despite the rumors, Vera had been refusing more clients recently, turning down people she would have once entertained. The clients I spoke with had their own stories. Several of them admitted they had heard the same whispers, that Vera would do anything for the right price. Some claimed they had paid for it themselves, describing intimate sessions where Vera would fulfill even their darkest fantasies. But even among the clients, there was doubt. A few mentioned that Vera had started rejecting them recently, even when their requests weren't extreme. It didn't add up. One client stood out. He openly admitted to paying for more than just a performance. He'd crossed the line into something more, and he had no shame in saying so. But what caught my attention was when he mentioned someone called Night Shadow. He's the one who told me Vera would do anything, the client confessed. He made it clear she had no limits. For the right price, she was all yours. The pieces were starting to come together. Night Shadow had actively fueled these rumors, setting the stage for Vera's downfall. Despite the rumors, Vera had begun rejecting certain clients, and that had made her a target. She had made enemies, and someone had taken her refusal personally. Vera had been trying to pull back, to escape that side of the business, but Night Shadow had pushed her too far, and now I needed to find out who he really was. Leon's penthouse was a far cry from the sterile, cold atmosphere of Vera's apartment. His space was dark and warm, bathed in the soft glow of amber lights and deep shadows that clung to every corner. It was the kind of place that felt intimate by design, meant for quiet whispers and secrets, a dangerous place to meet an ex-lover. I had to remind myself why I was here. Vera Lux's death, the case, the investigation, it was all starting to take shape, but every thread I pulled seemed to lead back to more questions. I needed answers from Leon. He was waiting for me by the window, the skyline of the city glowing faintly behind him. His posture was relaxed, his hands tucked into his pockets, but the air around him crackled with tension. Leon always had that effect. Calm on the surface, but with a fire burning just underneath. The kind of fire that pulled people in, that burned you if you got too close. As I stepped into the room, he turned, and his eyes caught mine. There it was, again, Those eyes, dark, intense, and filled with a heat I could feel from across the room. I told myself I'd keep it professional. I had to. But the moment our gazes locked, all the old feelings came rushing back, thick and hot. "Katie," he said, his voice smooth as silk, but there was something darker underneath. "You've found something." I took a breath, keeping my voice steady. "I've been talking to some of Vera's colleagues, other VR performers. They all had different stories, but one name keeps coming up: Night Shadow." Leon frowned, shaking his head. "I've never heard of him." I studied his face, searching for any crack, any sign he might be lying. But Leon was good. He was always good at keeping his secrets close. Still, something about the way he looked at me, the way his jaw tightened slightly, told me there was more he wasn't saying. "He's dangerous, Leon. Vera was afraid of him. She turned him down, rejected him. Maybe that's why she ended up dead." Leon's expression hardened, his gaze darkening. "She never mentioned anyone by that name to me, but she did talk about someone, a client who was causing trouble. He went by Marcus Vero. He made a stink about Vera rejecting his offer, and she told me he was becoming obsessive." "Marcus Vero," I repeated slowly. "Do you think he might be this Night Shadow? If Vera rejected him, it could explain why he escalated." He took a step closer, his presence overwhelming. "Keep digging, Katie. Find out who this Night Shadow is. Find out if this Marcus Vero is really behind all of it." But his voice dropped lower, a husky edge creeping in. "I can't pretend that's all I want from you." I felt it too, the electric pull, the undeniable tension that had been building between us since I'd first walked into the room. It was as if every moment was pushing us closer and closer to something we both knew was inevitable. "You always did have a way of complicating things, Leon," I said, my voice barely more than a whisper, but the heat in it was unmistakable. His hand came up, brushing against my arm, sending a shiver down my spine. The touch was so familiar, and yet it felt electric, like the first time all over again. "Leon," I whispered, my voice caught between wanting to pull away and wanting to fall into him. He moved closer still, his lips just a breath away from mine, his eyes dark and burning with the same hunger I felt building in my chest. "You don't have to say anything, Katie. You never did." Our lips met, and everything else melted away. The investigation, the case, even the danger surrounding us. There was only him, the heat of his body pressed against mine, the way his hands slid down, pulling me closer, like he couldn't stand the space between us. I kissed him back with everything I had, all the years of tension, of wanting, of needing to feel his touch again, flooding back in an overwhelming rush. His hands roamed my body, possessive, urgent, as if he was trying to make up for all the time we'd lost. And I let him, because in that moment, I didn't care about anything else but the way he made me feel alive, burning under his touch. My back hit the wall, and he was on me, his body pressing into mine, his lips trailing down my neck, rough and desperate. "You don't know how long I've been wanting this," he growled, his voice low and raw. I gasped as his teeth grazed my skin, his hands gripping my hips with a hunger that made my head spin. "We shouldn't be doing this," I managed to whisper, but even I didn't believe the words. "We've always been bad at shouldn't," he muttered against my skin, his lips finding mine again in a searing kiss that left me breathless. The air between us was electric, buzzing with an energy that had been building since the moment I stepped into the room. Leon's gaze locked on mine, and every instinct I had told me to pull back, to remind myself why I was really here. He chuckled, low and dark, his breath ghosting over my skin as he leaned in, lips grazing my ear. "You're fighting it, Katie. But you don't have to. Not with me. You never did." The feel of him hard, unyielding, his body hot against mine made my breath catch. He was right. I was fighting it. But the truth was I didn't want to. I didn't want to resist him. Not now. Not when every part of me was screaming to give in. Before I could think, before I could talk myself out of it, I grabbed him by the front of his shirt, pulling him to me again. The kiss was hard, rough, but it was everything I needed, everything I'd been holding back. His hands tangled in my hair, tugging just enough to send a shiver down my spine, his mouth devouring mine with a hunger I hadn't felt in years. His fingers slid under the hem of my shirt, the heat of his touch setting my skin on fire as he pushed the fabric up, over my head, tossing it to the floor. His lips followed, trailing down my neck, biting gently at the sensitive skin there. I gasped, my hands fisting in his shirt, pulling him closer. He growled against my throat, his hands sliding lower, gripping my waist, pulling me tight against him. "You drive me fucking crazy," he muttered, his voice rough, breathless. His words made my knees weak, and I found myself clutching at him, needing more. It was intoxicating the way he touched me, the way he spoke to me like I was the only thing in the world he wanted. I had no defenses against it, against him. His hands moved to the waistband of my trousers, tugging them down, his breath hot against my skin as he kissed his way lower, down my chest, my stomach, every inch of me burning under his touch. I couldn't think. I couldn't breathe. All I could do was feel every kiss, every brush of his fingers, every flick of his tongue. I should have stopped it, should have pushed him away, but I couldn't. I didn't want to. I needed him, more than I'd needed anything in a long time. My mind whirled, questioning how the hell I'd ended up here, in this moment, sleeping with the man who had hired me to investigate his lover's murder. I had sworn to keep it professional, to keep my distance, and yet here I was, giving in to the one person I knew I shouldn't. But all of those questions, all of the doubts, faded as his hands slid under my thighs, lifting me effortlessly, pressing me harder against the wall. The cool surface was a sharp contrast to the heat between us, but it only made the fire burn brighter, made me crave more. I wrapped my legs around his waist, pulling him closer, his body fitting perfectly against mine, like this was where we were meant to be all along. "Fuck, Katie," he groaned against my skin, his breath ragged as his hands roamed over me, possessive, rough. "I've missed this, missed you." I didn't respond. I couldn't. My body was already moving of its own accord, desperate to feel him, to get closer, to close the distance between us in every possible way. His hands gripped me harder, his lips never leaving mine as he moved us toward the bed, his body pressing me against the wall, hard and demanding. Everything about this felt like a whirlwind, a heated blur of emotions, touches, and sensations. I knew I should feel conflicted, yet in this moment none of it mattered. His smile lingered against my lips, his voice a low murmur. "Tell me what you want, Katie." "You," I whispered, my hands resting on his shoulders, my body responding instinctively to every touch, every word. "I want you." Before I realized it, he guided me to the bed, his presence overwhelming, every movement charged with intent. His kiss was deep and filled with a need that mirrored my own, igniting something within me that had been dormant for far too long. I arched into him, each moment drawing us closer, the tension snapping like a tightly wound thread. It was both forbidden and undeniable, a culmination of everything we had resisted. Every touch, every movement was a spark that lit the fire we had both been suppressing. He moved with a rhythm that was deliberate yet instinctive, a synchronization that left me breathless. Each connection felt like a moment suspended in time, every whisper, every gaze pulling us further into a world that was entirely our own. His presence consumed me, yet it felt freeing, as though nothing else existed but this. The intensity between us grew, the boundaries between thought and feeling dissolving. Every moment brought a heightened sense of closeness, his voice low and grounding, reminding me of why I had been drawn to him from the start. The air around us seemed to thicken, charged with something unspoken, yet understood. Time seemed to blur, each second stretching into eternity as the connection deepened. My breath caught as he looked at me, his expression one of focus and intensity, a reminder of the emotions we had both been holding back. There was no hesitation now, only the truth of what had been building between us. I whispered his name, my voice soft but filled with the intensity of the moment, every part of me drawn to him like a tide to the shore. His hands tightened on my waist, grounding me, steadying me as the emotions between us surged like an unrelenting wave. He pulled me closer, his touch firm, but filled with unspoken tenderness, as if trying to convey everything words could not. His voice was low, gravelly, carrying the weight of emotions we had kept buried for far too long. Every movement felt deliberate, every connection deeper than the last, as if we were rediscovering something we thought we'd lost. Time seemed to stretch and bend around us, every second an eternity filled with the quiet rhythm of our breaths and the unyielding pull that held us together. There was nothing else, just this unspoken understanding, this need that neither of us could deny. When the moment reached its crescendo, it felt like the world itself paused, every sensation heightened, every emotion laid bare, and when the tension finally ebbed, it left behind a sense of calm, like the first light of dawn after a long night. We stayed close, our breaths mingling as the quiet settled around us. His hand traced gentle patterns along my back, a comforting reminder of the bond we had shared as the world outside faded into insignificance. I looked up at him, his gaze steady and warm, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I felt at peace. "Leon," I murmured, my voice barely above a whisper. "There's still so much I need to know." He sighed, his hand resting lightly on my back as his eyes locked with mine. "I already told you, Katie. I didn't know much. She kept a lot from me." I searched his face, looking for any crack in his composure, any hint of the truth he might be hiding. There was something there. I could feel it. But even now, with everything still lingering between us, I couldn't bring myself to press him further. Not yet. I sat up, brushing my hair back as I glanced around the room. "We should clean up," I said, trying to break the tension. "This place is a bit of a mess." He smirked, his gaze following me as I stood and stretched, his eyes darkening with a playful intensity. "Messy? I'd call it perfect." I shot him a look over my shoulder, a faint flush rising to my cheeks. "Perfect or not, I'm taking a shower." As I walked to the bathroom, I could feel his gaze lingering on me, the air still thick with unspoken words. The bathroom was a reflection of the penthouse itself, marble and glass, elegant and pristine. The rain shower cascaded down like a gentle waterfall. I turned the water on, letting it heat up before stepping under the stream, feeling the warmth wash over me, soothing every tense muscle. I stood there for a while, letting the heat envelop me, letting it wash away the remnants of the evening. My hands moved over my skin in slow, deliberate motions as I lathered the soap, scrubbing away the traces of what had passed. Yet I couldn't fully shake the memory of him, the way he had looked at me, the way his presence had lingered. The water cascaded down as I worked shampoo into my hair, the scent rising softly in the warm steam. It felt grounding, a moment of quiet amidst the storm of emotions. I let the water flow over me, rinsing everything away. Yet some part of me clung to the warmth of his touch, the weight of his gaze. Once I finished, I stepped out, wrapping myself in a towel. As I heard the shower start again, I knew he had taken my place under the spray. The faint sound of him humming reached me, relaxed and unguarded, a rare moment of peace. That was my cue. My heart raced as I moved quickly through the penthouse. I had a hunch, and I wasn't leaving without confirming it. Leon had his secrets, and if he wasn't going to tell me, I'd uncover them myself. I found his office, the door slightly ajar, and slipped inside. The room was dimly lit, his computer resting quietly on the desk. It took only a few seconds to bring the screen to life. I retrieved a small drive from my bag, plugging it into the port as my fingers moved swiftly over the keys, navigating through his files. He had been careful, but not careful enough. My breath hitched as I located an encrypted folder. My heart pounded as I began downloading its contents, each passing second stretching into an eternity. I didn't know exactly what I'd found, but I knew it was significant. Something he hadn't wanted me to see. In the distance, I heard the shower turn off. Quickly, I disconnected the drive, slipping it back into my bag before quietly making my way back to the living room. There would be time to go through the files later. For now, I had a new destination, Marcus Vero. Marcus Vero sat across from me in his high-rise apartment, a place brimming with opulence. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the glittering city skyline, the soft hues of dusk, casting a warm glow over the space. Everything about him exuded power and precision. Impeccably dressed in a tailored suit, his demeanor was calm, collected, controlled. But beneath that polished exterior, there was something else. A shadow lingered in his gaze, a subtle tension simmering just below the surface. Whatever secrets he held, I was determined to uncover them. He had agreed to meet with me when I mentioned I was interviewing Vera's high-profile clients. The more he spoke, the clearer it became. His words revealed more than he intended. His eyes gleamed when he talked about Vera, the tightness in his jaw betraying his emotions when I brought up her exclusive services. There was more to his story than he let on. "So, you were one of Vera's clients?" I asked casually, watching him closely. He leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping lightly against the armrest. "I wouldn't call it that," he said, with a faint smirk. "We had an arrangement. I paid for her time, sure, but it wasn't like the others. She gave me more attention. It was personal." Personal. That word lingered in the air, heavy with implication. I'd heard it before, but this time it carried a sharper edge. Vera wasn't like the others. He didn't just want her time. He wanted control. "Personal?" I echoed, raising an eyebrow. "You mean she gave you what you wanted? No questions asked?" His smirk faded, replaced by something colder. "Something like that," he replied, his tone clipped. I shifted slightly, leaning forward, my gaze steady. "But recently, I heard she started turning people down, long-time clients. Did she ever refuse you?" For a moment, his calm demeanor cracked. His jaw tightened, his fingers gripping the edge of the armrest. "She refused me once," he admitted, his voice low. "After everything I'd given her, she acted like she didn't need me anymore, like my money wasn't enough." I nodded, encouraging him to continue, even as my pulse quickened. This was it, the opening I had been waiting for. "She told me she wasn't interested in what I wanted anymore," he continued, his voice growing harder. "Said she had limits, but Vera didn't have limits. She did whatever I wanted as long as I paid, and I paid a lot." His frustration was palpable. His knuckles turned white as he gripped the arms of the chair. The emotion in his eyes wasn't just anger. It was something darker, something that had been festering for far too long. "And what was it that you wanted, Marcus?" I asked, my voice steady yet probing. He hesitated, his eyes narrowing slightly as if measuring how much to reveal. Nothing we hadn't done before, nothing she hadn't already agreed to. She just acted like she was above it all. My pulse quickened, though I kept my expression calm. The pieces were falling into place. Marcus Vero wasn't just another client. He was Night Shadow, the one who had blurred the lines, who had pushed boundaries and expected Vera to comply. And when she finally refused, he hadn't been able to accept it. "Why do you think she refused?" I asked, my voice soft but insistent. His eyes darkened, the shadows within them deepening. "She got scared, thought she could walk away. But that's not how it works. Not with someone like me." The air between us thickened, charged with the weight of his words. This wasn't about a simple disagreement or a broken arrangement. This was about control, about power. And when Vera had denied him that power, he had taken it in the only way he knew how. My heart raced as the truth became undeniable. Marcus Vero had taken everything from Vera, not just her life, but the autonomy she had tried to reclaim. He had become Night Shadow, feeding the rumors, manipulating her clients, pushing her beyond her limits. I leaned back slightly, letting the realization settle. I had found him, but now I needed to leave before he understood just how much I had uncovered. With a small smile, I kept my tone light. "Thank you. You've been very helpful." He smirked, leaning back in his chair, his confidence palpable. "You're welcome." But as I turned to leave, the truth burned within me. Marcus Vero was Night Shadow, and he was going to face justice for what he had done. All I needed now was the proof. Later that night, I sat alone in my office, the dim glow of the computer screen illuminating the quiet space. As I sifted through the files I had taken from Leon's penthouse, a sense of unease settled over me. I had been reckless, snooping through his system, but something deep inside had warned me that Leon wasn't being entirely honest. And now, as I scrolled through the data, my suspicions were confirmed. Leon had known more about Vera's business than he had let on. Among the files were detailed records of clients, transactions, and communications. In those records, the name Night Shadow appeared repeatedly. Leon had been tracking him, watching as Night Shadow brought clients with darker, more dangerous needs to Vera. One log stood out, detailing how Night Shadow had promised satisfaction guaranteed to his clients and referred them directly to Vera. Leon, it seemed, had been investigating Night Shadow on his own. I leaned back in my chair, the pieces of the puzzle slowly coming together. Leon had known all along that Night Shadow was involved in Vera's business, that he had been pushing her toward clients she wanted to avoid. But why hadn't Leon told me? Why had he kept this to himself? Even after everything we had been through. I stared at the screen, my mind racing. The connections were clear now. Marcus Vero, angry, obsessed, and dangerous. was night shadow. But how deep did it go? And what else was Leon still hiding from me? I didn't have all the answers yet, but I was determined to find them. Back at Leon's penthouse, I confronted him with what I had discovered. He leaned casually against the kitchen island, a glass of whiskey in hand, his dark eyes fixed intently on mine. The room felt charged with something unsaid, the tension palpable. "I think Marcus Vero is Night Shadow," I said, stepping closer, my voice steady but deliberate. He had the motive, the anger, and he was furious when Vera turned him down. Leon's lips curled into a slow, knowing smile, but his eyes held something darker, a shadow of something feral, simmering just below the surface. "You really think it was Marcus?" he asked softly, his voice barely audible as he swirled the amber liquid in his glass. The air between us seemed to hum with tension, an invisible current running beneath every word and glance. He stepped closer, his presence filling the space between us, the warmth of his body drawing me in despite the alarms ringing in my mind. His hand brushed against my arm, sliding gently down my side, sending a subtle shiver through me. "Yes, and I think you agree," I said, meeting his gaze, my voice steady though my heart raced. "I found the notes, the ones about Night Shadow." His hand stilled on my arm, his expression faltering for just a moment before returning to its usual unreadable calm. But I had seen it, the flicker of something raw, a moment of vulnerability. "You found my notes?" he asked, his voice low, tension rippling through his words. I nodded, stepping closer, until the distance between us was barely more than a whisper. "You knew, didn't you? You suspected, but you didn't tell me." Leon's jaw tightened, the intensity in his expression mirrored in the air between us. His hand slid up my back, steadying me, his grip firm yet grounding. His voice softened, carrying the weight of something unspoken. "I didn't tell you because I couldn't prove it. I needed you to see it for yourself." Before I could respond, his lips brushed against mine, a fleeting moment of desperation and need. My hands instinctively gripped his shirt as I found myself drawn deeper into the moment, his urgency becoming my own. His touch was rougher than usual, his movements bolder, as if he could no longer hold back. "I couldn't prove it either," I whispered against him, my voice shaky yet resolute. "But I'm here now." A low growl escaped him as his hand traced the curve of my neck, his touch lingering, his words barely above a murmur. "We'll prove it together," he said, his voice filled with quiet determination. "You and me. We'll finish this." The room was filled with an unspoken intensity, every movement charged with purpose. Our words blurred into murmurs as the space between us disappeared, and his touch lingered with a quiet command, drawing me closer until the rest of the world faded away. His hands moved with a mixture of urgency and care, each motion leaving a trail of warmth and unspoken meaning. His presence was overwhelming, his gaze steady and filled with a depth that made me forget everything else. Every moment felt deliberate, as if we were teetering on the edge of something we couldn't turn away from. There was a new rhythm to the night, one that was both unfamiliar and yet completely consuming. I let go, allowing myself to surrender to the trust and understanding that seemed to flow between us. Every action, every breath felt like a silent conversation, a dialogue that needed no words to be understood. As the moments stretched, the weight of control shifted, and I let it slip from my grasp willingly. For the first time, I wasn't the one in control, and it didn't feel like a loss. It felt like trust, like freedom. His voice was low, a steady anchor in the storm of emotions that swirled around us, grounding me even as everything else seemed to dissolve. The air seemed to hum with electricity, a tension that wasn't oppressive, but rather exhilarating. I could see it in his eyes, a mixture of strength and vulnerability that mirrored my own. This wasn't about dominance or submission. It was about connection, about finding balance in the unlikeliest of places. The night deepened, and with it came a quiet understanding. This wasn't just a moment, it was a revelation, a truth we had both been too afraid to face until now. And in that truth, there was a kind of peace, a shared acknowledgement that this was something we had been moving toward all along. The atmosphere between us was charged, each moment more intense than the last. The air seemed to hum with anticipation as his presence enveloped me, his every move deliberate and commanding. There was an undeniable thrill in the way he held me, the way his actions carried both strength and purpose. I wasn't sure how long we stayed caught in that unspoken rhythm, but when his gaze locked with mine, time itself seemed to pause. His intensity was magnetic, his focus unyielding. Every touch, every motion was a silent conversation, one that spoke of trust, of connection, of something deeper than words could convey. The tension built with each passing second, a delicate balance of control and surrender that left me breathless. I could feel the weight of his resolve, the strength in his actions tempered by a quiet care that grounded me even as the intensity between us grew. "You're not afraid," he murmured, his voice low, a challenge and a promise wrapped into one. I met his gaze, my breath steady despite the storm within me. "No," I replied softly, "not with you." The night deepened, the air thick with unspoken understanding. Every movement was precise, every gesture carrying a weight that neither of us could ignore. It wasn't just about the moment. It was about trust, about letting go of the walls we had both built. And in that trust, there was freedom. As the tension reached its peak, I could see the shift in his expression, a flicker of something raw and unguarded. The connection between us wasn't just physical, it was emotional, a meeting of two souls that had been drawn to each other against all odds. And in that moment, I let myself fall, knowing that he would catch me. I wish Vera had done this. It would have been so much simpler. The words barely registered at first, their weight lost in the haze of the moment. My mind struggled to process them, caught between the intensity of his presence and the whisper of doubt that had begun to creep in. His actions were deliberate, calculated, each touch commanding attention, yet his words hung in the air, unresolved. Simpler. What had he meant by that? My thoughts spun, reaching for clarity, but his unrelenting focus left no room for introspection. The way he held me was firm, almost overwhelming, pulling me closer every time I tried to retreat, every time my instincts begged me to step back. My body responded on its own, but my mind was screaming for me to listen. And then the truth hit me, sharp and cold, like a blade cutting through the fog. Leon killed her. The realization settled in with a brutal finality. For so long I had believed the lies, chasing shadows, convinced that Marcus Vera was the answer, the villain in Vera's story. But the truth was here, in front of me, wrapped in the deceptive warmth of someone I had trusted too easily. It wasn't Marcus, it was Leon. Leon, who had pulled me into his world, into his bed, weaving a web of manipulation so tightly that I hadn't even seen it coming. The notes, the investigation, it had never been about uncovering the truth about Night Shadow. It had been about protecting his own secrets. Vera had uncovered them, had pieced together the truth about what Leon had been doing, and for that, she had paid the price. Leon had known my weakness, used it against me, drawing me closer to ensure I would never see the full picture. And now I was here, trapped, bound by more than just physical ties, the weight of betrayal heavy against my chest. His grip loosened slightly, his breath brushing against my ear as he whispered something I couldn't quite make out, but it didn't matter. My mind was too loud, too chaotic, as I fought to make sense of the impossible. Don't let him know. Not yet. Don't let him see you know. I forced myself to focus, steadying my breath, willing my body to stay calm. I had to keep playing along, pretending I was still caught in his web. It was the only way to get through this, to find an opening. I had to finish what I started. I let out a sound softer than I intended, but it worked. His movements quickened, his grip tightening, pulling me closer. The weight of his presence, his intensity pressed down on me, suffocating but calculated. Every touch should have felt commanding, but now, all it did was feed the gnawing sense of unease I couldn't shake. "You love this, don't you?" he growled, his voice low, a challenge hidden beneath his words. I managed a breathless laugh, leaning into the facade I'd constructed. "I do," I whispered, forcing the words past the knot in my throat. "I love it." He pushed further, his pace unrelenting, each moment more desperate, as if he were trying to hold on to something slipping through his fingers. My eyes closed briefly, my mind spiraling between reality and the role I was playing. Every second felt like walking a tightrope, teetering dangerously close to falling. My body responded automatically, a mask of compliance, even as my mind screamed against the truth. Leon, the man I had trusted, the man I had let in, was a killer. He had used Vera, and now he was using me. I had to remind myself of the purpose behind my actions, of the plan I needed to execute to escape this. I leaned into the act, letting my body mirror what he expected. My breaths came uneven, deliberate, urging him toward the finish. Each motion was calculated, every sound designed to draw him closer to the edge, giving me just enough space to act when the moment came. His grip tightened, his breath brushing against my ear, filled with words that might have meant something once, but now felt empty. The tension in the air shifted, wild and raw, the weight of unspoken truths hanging heavy between us. I squeezed my eyes shut, forcing myself to focus, to quiet the storm in my mind. This was a game I had to win, a performance I couldn't afford to falter in. I knew what he needed to believe, what would push him to let his guard down. I arched my back slightly, my breaths uneven, each one designed to pull him further into the illusion I was crafting. "Yes, Leon," I gasped softly, my voice shaky yet deliberate. So close. His movements grew more urgent, the tension in his body building with every passing second. I could feel his control slipping, the barrier between his dominance and vulnerability breaking apart. His gaze bore into mine, heavy and intent, searching for the validation he craved. My heart pounded, my thoughts racing to keep pace with the rhythm between us. I had to let go of every instinct telling me to pull away, to recoil. Instead, I leaned into the act, letting out a sound that felt foreign, my body mirroring his every motion, as I faked the shiver of surrender he so desperately sought. "Yes," I cried, my voice filled with a carefully crafted urgency. "Leon, I'm coming." His body tensed, his breath catching as he reached the edge. With one final shuddering movement, he collapsed against me, his breathing heavy, his grip loosening. I stayed still, holding my breath, letting him believe he had won, letting him bask in the illusion of control. But I wasn't done yet. The ache in my wrists, where the bindings had pressed into my skin, was a sharp reminder of how close I had come to losing everything. But I couldn't let him see that. He couldn't see the fear I buried deep, the knowledge of what he had done, of the truth I now carried, like a heavy weight in my chest. Leon had killed Vera, and now I had to ensure that he didn't escape the consequences. As he lay back, a smirk of satisfaction playing across his lips, I forced myself to remain calm, my expression unreadable. He thought he had me. He thought the game was over. But it wasn't. Not yet. "I need some water," I said softly, my voice breathless as I pushed myself off the bed. I pretended to be a little dazed, still reeling from the intensity of our encounter. In truth, I was, but for reasons Leon could never suspect. He grinned lazily as I stood, his gaze lingering. I walked to the kitchen, my heart pounding with each step. I grabbed a bottle of water, my eyes stealing a fleeting glance at my phone sitting on the counter. There was no room for hesitation now. I had a plan. Taking a steadying breath, I returned to the room, settling on the edge of the bed. My stomach churned as I thought about what I had to do next. Every instinct screamed at me to stop, but I knew there was no turning back. I leaned in closer, letting my body press against his, hiding my fear behind a veil of composure. Leon's expression softened, his body relaxing into the promise of what he thought would come next. I straddled him carefully, every movement deliberate, each touch calculated to keep him at ease. He leaned into me, his gaze heavy-lidded, his breathing shallow. I could feel the tension leaving his frame, his guard dropping. I pressed my lips to his, letting the kiss deepen as my hands wandered over him, memorizing every detail while my mind raced ahead. His hands found their way to my hips, his grip firm, yet unguarded, his trust implicit. I let the moment stretch, drawing him further into the illusion. But I wasn't finished, not yet. As our lips parted, my fingers found the soft silk ropes discarded on the edge of the bed. Leon didn't flinch as I brought them into play, didn't question when I wrapped them gently around his wrists. His trust was absolute, his body pliant as I secured him to the headboard with care, my heart thundering as each knot tightened. "Do you trust me?" I whispered, my voice brushing against his ear. "Completely," he replied, his voice thick and low. A faint smile touched my lips as I tied the final knot, ensuring his escape was impossible. He exhaled slowly, his body fully relaxed, unaware of the shift in control. For a fleeting moment, the tension in the air softened, but within me, the storm only grew stronger. Leaning back, I traced a finger along his chest, letting my expression shift subtly, an almost imperceptible change. "I know what you did, Leon," I said softly, my voice calm but steady, the undertone impossible to ignore. His body tensed beneath me, his eyes narrowing as the weight of my words began to register. "What are you talking about?" he asked, though his voice lacked the usual confidence, an edge of uncertainty creeping in. I leaned closer, my lips brushing against his neck, where I could feel the rapid beat of his pulse beneath the surface. "Vera," I whispered, my breath warm against his skin, the name carrying a weight that made him still. For a moment, he said nothing, his silence speaking volumes. His wide eyes betrayed the fear he tried so hard to mask, and in that moment, I knew I had him. "Marcus Vero killed her," he said at last, his voice low, the words deliberate but unconvincing. He was trying to steer the conversation, trying to keep the truth buried. His eyes followed the path of my hand as I traced lazy circles across his chest, his discomfort evident in the tension of his muscles. I kept my movements deliberate, slow, careful. "You said that," I replied, my voice low but firm. "But we both know the truth, don't we, Leon?" My words hung in the air, sharp and undeniable. I felt the slight shudder in his body, saw the doubt flicker in his eyes, the cracks beginning to form in his carefully constructed defenses. "It excites you, doesn't it?" he asked hesitantly, his voice lacking its usual authority. A faint smile touched my lips as I leaned in closer, my breath brushing his ear. "The control," I said softly, each word calculated, steady. "Knowing that you were the one holding all the strings." His gaze met mine, and for the first time, I saw uncertainty replace his usual resolve. The facade he'd maintained so perfectly for so long was beginning to crumble, and I could feel the power shifting, the balance tilting ever so slightly in my favor. I watched his eyes as he absorbed my words, his expression shifting, the shadows deepening. My heart raced, but I maintained my composure, letting the silence stretch before pushing further. "Tell me, Leon," I breathed softly, tracing my fingers along his jaw. "What really happened? What did you do to Vera?" For a moment, he didn't respond, his gaze fixed on mine as though searching for something. Hesitation, weakness, anything to give him an edge. But I gave him nothing, only a soft, unreadable expression that invited trust. With a low exhale, Leon relaxed beneath me, his lips curving into a dark smile. "It wasn't supposed to go that far," he murmured, his voice low, almost a whisper. I shifted slightly, leaning in closer as though drawn by his words. "Business?" I whispered, the word hanging delicately between us. "Vera was the star," he said, his voice steady but carrying a dangerous undertone. "Her performances, her presence in VR. People couldn't get enough of her. They'd pay anything for just a taste. But for some, it wasn't enough. They wanted more." A chill ran down my spine, but I forced a small smile, keeping my voice smooth. "And you gave them what they wanted?" I asked, letting my fingers trail down his chest in slow, deliberate movements. "You're the kind of man who goes after what he wants. That's impressive." I saw the shift in his demeanor, the way his guard slipped, lulled by flattery and seduction. His eyes darkened, and he tilted his head slightly, his confidence growing. "I saw an opportunity, hunted Tamar," he admitted, his tone turning sharper, more arrogant. "I created an AI replica of Vera, a perfect version. The clients thought it was her, but it wasn't. The AI could do anything they wanted." My stomach twisted at his words, but I kept my face neutral, curious. "And Vera didn't know?" I asked, my voice light, though every nerve in my body screamed at the revelation. He chuckled darkly, shaking his head. "Number as far as she knew, everything was as it had always been. I used her account to run the AI. The clients believed it was her, believed they were getting the real thing." I swallowed hard, suppressing the disgust threatening to rise. But eventually, something changed, didn't it? My voice remained calm, a quiet question laced with tension, daring him to reveal the truth. Leon's smile faltered, his eyes flickering with something darker, regret, fear, or perhaps anger. "Yeah," he said slowly, his voice weighed down with unspoken tension. "Some of the clients' requests started reaching Vera. She didn't understand what they were talking about at first, so she came to me. I told her it was just a mix-up, that some clients were misunderstanding the situation." "And she believed you?" I asked softly, raising an eyebrow, my voice carrying just enough skepticism to make him hesitate. "For a while," he admitted, his words a reluctant confession. But Vera was sharp. She started digging, asking questions. She found out about the AI, about everything. I leaned down, closing the space between us, my lips brushing lightly against his ear. "And that's when you killed her," I whispered, letting the weight of those words linger in the air. For a moment, silence stretched between us, taut and electric. Leon's eyes clouded with something sinister, something that sent a chill racing down my spine. And then he smiled, a slow, dangerous curve of his lips that made my stomach twist. "She would have ruined everything," he said, his tone chillingly calm. "I had no choice." Disgust rose in my throat, sharp and bitter, but I forced it down. My hand reached up to his face, caressing it with an almost tender touch, my expression one of feigned understanding. "You did what you had to do," I murmured. Leaning back, I let my demeanor shift, my warmth dissolving into something colder, sharper. Leon's brows furrowed in confusion, his confidence cracking as I climbed off him, my movements deliberate. I dressed quickly, my phone secure in my hand, while he tugged futilely against the restraints. The realization hit him like a thunderclap, his eyes widening in sheer horror. You recorded me?" he stammered, his voice a mix of disbelief and panic. I turned to face him, my gaze steady, my voice calm but unyielding. "You thought you could control me," I said, each word cutting through the air like a blade. But I was always one step ahead. Not entirely true, but close enough. Before Leon could respond, the door to the penthouse swung open. 2 police officers, whom I had called while stepping away for water, entered the room. Their eyes locked on Leon, still bound to the bed. He struggled against the ropes, panic flashing across his face. But it was too late. "I think you'll want to hear this," I said, handing one of the officers my phone with the recording of Leon's confession. The officers moved forward, untying Leon from the bed and restraining him with handcuffs. He turned to glare at me, fury etched into his expression. But I stood firm. I met his gaze, my voice calm but unwavering. "You thought you could control me," I said softly, "but the truth always finds a way." As the police led Leon away, I stood there for a moment, my body trembling slightly from the rush of adrenaline. It was over. I had made him confess, and now for the first time, I could finally breathe.